Season 6 of the Missing Witches podcast is sponsored in part by Foxglove Farm. Go to Foxglove Farm, that's farm with a PH like pharmacy.com, and use offer code MISSINGWITCHES when you sign up for your monthly subscription box of witchy delights. And sponsored by listeners like you. You who join our Patreon and come to our Coven meetings, who buy our book, recommend it to your friends, and review it online. We thank you. And if you love this episode, tip us at paypal.me/missingwitches.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Happy Mabon!
Oh, happy Mabon, Amy. Happy Mabon, witches. We're here. We're at the second harvest, the peak harvest, the middle harvest. How do you think of it?
I think of it as the autumn equinox and the beginning of turning from one half of the year into another half of the year. The leaves are turning and falling, like it's official. I pull out my knitting needles and my bread baking pans, and the whole world sort of starts to shift at this point.
Totally, yeah. I experimented with growing butternut squash this year. We kept all the seeds from all our organic squash throughout the year, and then had a little seed farm going in a weird dark corner of the basement, and they just kept sprouting. So I just kept growing them. So I planted 25 butternut squash plants. I had to build down a hill new chunks of dirt and stuff, and then they grow 15 feet, so they're just sprawling down this hill, and I have to hand pollinate them all because there aren't enough pollinators anymore or this year. So I'm out there hand pollinating them every day. So right now this is the gourd harvest and the fruit harvest, and I'm just watching my little babies grow fat. We go visit the butternut squash babies every day.
Yeah, it is amazing to behold, for sure. Some of our listeners, I'm sure some of our listeners have heard the ongoing saga of me and my elderberry bushes. I didn't even think they would flower. I only planted them last year. Yeah, and they flowered, and I have about, I don't know, I want to say I just harvested them. I want to say I have maybe an eighth of a cup of elderberries, maybe a quarter of. I haven't actually measured them yet, so I'm gonna try to make myself, a half a cup of elderberry syrup if I can. But it's a good start, one quarter cup at a time, one baby squash at a time.
That's it. We got to start somewhere, and we just got to nourish our attempts. I keep telling my Marigold, you got to try stuff. You got to try stuff in life. Sometimes it doesn't work. Just try to not let her feel but try not to feel myself too much down on myself. And these are just experiments, it's just play, and just trying to foster a little bit more play in our life, and plant some seeds and see, maybe we'll get one more squash next year. Maybe I'll get another eighth of a cup.
Right. And that's why I love the equinoxes, especially because it's sort of that permission to succeed and fail, and recognize the power and utility of both of those,
totally
events.
Yeah, I think that the pagan symbolism, and Mabon as a pagan holiday is 1970s, which, I like the 70s. I'm down for that. I think it's obviously celebrating the equinox is ancient and multicultural, but this idea of Mabon and the idea of the harvest queen at her full regal height, and the king, the god king dying with the last cutting of the grain, it really does contain that moment of shining and tipping to the dark, and that we're at that turn of the wheel, and we're at that turn of the wheel, witches, where the goddesses are blazing.
Yeah. And it's the 3rd year anniversary of the Missing Witches project, so that feels kind of special too. We love our 3s. It seems very, very distant, and also yesterday that
My goodness, it's only 3 years. It's like 300 years. And also, I just feel like I'm barely starting to understand what I'm doing.
yeah, that's it. And that I mean, I talk about this all the time, but that's what I love about this project is that it's just like an opportunity to learn, and none of our listeners are expecting us to be, authoritarian on our takes. We're just all learning about this stuff together, and I love getting emails from listeners and sort of interacting about everything that we're contending with. Obviously, it's a big, wide net that we
Yeah.
cast with the things we talk about.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Thank you so much for your emails. We got some really wonderful emails recently. People just write us and they're like, do you know about this witch? Or like, I feel like this is a witch. She doesn't call herself a witch, but let me tell you about this bitch. It's like so exciting. We always like file those away with glee. Yeah, and I mean, speaking of constantly learning and some of the witches that we get to learn from, this episode that we're about to sort of slip into here after Amy and I hang out with you all for a bit is a conversation with one of the witches that we've gotten to learn so much from since the very first season, Whitefeather Hunter.
Yeah, and as we come up on our 100th episode, which I think will be in a couple of weeks, it's amazing to have been interacting with Whitefeather sort of throughout this process. She's been a real touchstone for us. One editor's note is that this wasn't the case when we spoke, but it is the case now, so it's very cool. Snakehair Press is going to be publishing the BioArt Coven Manifesto that we're talking about in their upcoming Occult Studies Volume 2. So we will link to that in the show notes.
I mean, we could get excited and tell you about all the wonderful things that Whitefeather is about to tell you, but you might as well just get a tea or a whiskey or an eighth of a cup of elderberry syrup and dig in. Happy Mabon, witches.
Happy Mabon.
So can I officially welcome you back to the Missing Witches podcast?
Hello, yay!
I think Whitefeather.
Hi.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Whitefeather, but I think this is your 4th appearance on the Missing Witches podcast. We had In the Lab, and then you came on by yourself and we talked about blood. And then the COVID Coven. The COVID Coven episode. Right. This is number 4. There are definitely, Risa, I think you'll agree, certain voices that we keep returning to.
Mm-hmm.
And yours is definitely one of them.
I didn't realize that this was the 4th.
Yeah, awesome. You've really been a through line for our listeners, and I think your work is one of the things we get talked to the most about. People are the most excited because I think and I think we were the most electrified in meeting you, the way that you kind of tapped into our own feeling too, that there was this potential to like love and be respectful of and be deep in the sciences, and also to have like a strong theoretical understanding of what it means to be deviant, as you say in your thesis, what it means to be like a feminist deviant in these spaces. So, and this time you're back, and it feels like you're back with this like tentacular morphing formation of science witches. There's like 50 plus witches with you, who've signed on to this collaborative manifesto, and so it feels like there's this wave, this movement of witches in labs that you represent for us today. I read the manifesto. I basically highlighted the whole thing, which wasn't useful for preparing to ask you questions. But I did want to start with one piece and then see if you would talk from there about this movement and where you're at with thinking about this gathering of witches. So this short quote: "We claim the discursive space of witch as a useful location for building mycelial connections of solidarity and resistance, to imagine new ways of being, and to manifest our discoveries and creations with specific attention to dismantling systems of oppression." First of all, fuck yeah. And can you talk from there?
It's so crazy because this manifesto was developed through, I guess, kind of what I would call the exquisite corpse technique, but it was done, through a couple of different digital forums. The course itself was taught through video conferencing software and had people tuning in from different time zones, from different places around the world, all together to, construct rituals and construct this manifesto. And so the sentence that you just read is, an amalgamation of like multiple different people's thoughts, all kind of pieced together, like Frankenstein, like, I guess, which really resonates for me because I'm working in, biotechnology, which is kind of like a physical manifestation of what this manifesto is trying to do, I guess, on a philosophical and a conceptual realm. So it's, this segment that you read is kind of this dance back and forth between the magical physicality that we're working with as biotech witches or witches in labs or, eco-feminists or all of the many kind of identifiers that we use with creative strategies that support our philosophical standpoint. So, there are several of the practitioners, the witches involved in the BioArt Coven, who work with mycelium as a substrate, as a way to explore interconnectedness between this crazy global network of sci-tech, ancestral tech witches. So it's a powerful metaphor. It's also pointing to the actuality of what some of us do. We have this shared ethos that's decolonial, that's anti-racist, that's, all of these things that we talk about. So anyway, that's my long-winded answer.
There's never too long of an answer on this stuff. I mean, and I want to circle back to so many things you just said there, but I was doing full body yeses from the start when you talked about the exquisite corpse technique. I loved that from your the piece you shared with us, sort of describing the process of creating the manifesto. That struck home for me. I'd just been talking about exquisite corpse as a way of like helping adults I know play, that of like getting into this co-creation, this space of play and co-creation that for me is spell work. And so having people engage with play in that exact way, and also the idea of the body, which I think so much of your work touches on the body as a site for magic, and the idea that there is no waste. There's just not looking closely enough, that I think is also in the manifesto. Can you talk a bit about the body and waste, and maybe the corpse as a site of power or something?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, other than the fact that the corpse is a playground for all kinds of different microbial species, there is, for your listeners who don't know or aren't familiar with this creative strategy of exquisite corpse technique, it's a surrealist strategy where multiple people in a group sort of non-hierarchically co-construct a piece of text or a painting or a drawing or, in our case, a manifesto, but we've also used it to co-construct a group spell. So, it's looking at strategies that allow for this horizontal distribution of power. And that reflects our own approach to looking at bodies, because, there are these old philosophies about the body where the head is at the top, literally, and therefore, what's going on in the mind is more important. Of course, the vagina is pretty much at the bottom. We're kind of flipping all of that into a more horizontal structuring so that we can, look at all of the areas with shared importance. And so, it's this constant dance back and forth between what's philosophically important to us and restructuring the way that we look at bodies, and in particular, the female body, because it's just been subjugated for so long in so many different cultures and eras. So that's kind of, all of that is happening through decolonial, anti-capitalist, anti-racist lens.
Okay, so I wondered if you can make that more specific by maybe giving us some examples of work of yourself and witches in the Coven when it comes back to waste and the body.
Yeah, so some of your listeners may be familiar with, previous episodes where I talked about my work where I'm extracting stem cells from my own menstrual fluid and also separating menstrual fluid into its component parts to extract a serum, which is full of, wonderful proteins that can actually support cellular life in vitro. So, looking at this, I mean, waste, like body waste, any kind of bodily waste is a taboo topic. And, these are often synonymous with witches. There's a really, easy relationship that can be made there. If we just looked at the example of huts, okay? So this is one example I like to give people often. Think about, certain cultures, certain different times. I don't want to be specific to any one, but menstrual huts do exist. Sometimes they are, negative in context. Sometimes they're not negative in context. Sometimes they're places of empowerment. The witch also lives in a hut at the edge of the village, and this is a way of separating something from the dominant social order of things. So, in this way, witches themselves are the waste of their village, I guess. Often we understand that witches are elder women. They are, members of the social group whose value is no longer understood, seen, or respected. So they become social waste. Again, relating this back to bodily waste, we have some members of the group who, through the workshops that we did in the BioArt Coven class, learned how to collect and use their own menstrual fluid to make agar plates to culture different microbial species on that they swabbed from their own bodies. And so, it's this circular kind of way of working with like kitchen science, because, not many of us have access to labs these days, to kind of get to understand the microbial communities on their own bodies and get to understand the power of this waste material that's coming from their body to nurture and sustain other forms of life. So, it's just a paradigm shift really to take something that's so taboo to kind of reclaim these taboos in terms of a witch identity, but also in terms of the power of our bodies and what they're capable of.
One of my favorite things about the manifesto, the BioArt Coven manifesto, is how intentionally contradictory it is. I'll give you some examples so you know exactly what I'm talking about, because I think this is just so much of what we in modern society can't get our hands around, this binaric thinking that has like infiltrated us so much. You talk about the need to both mystify and demystify. Another example that you give is that language can be a source of oppression and liberation. So can you talk about like the great contradiction of both science and magic and life and death?
Oh my God.
Just a little bit.
Oh my God. That's huge. That's huge. I mean, so we are seeing so much amplification of this kind of binary thinking that you're talking about currently in our present circumstances, in our globalized society, through social media and the handling of all of the political issues that we are facing right now. We have kind of lost the capacity for nuanced thinking about truth. You know, what is truth, and anything that's not a person's truth is fake news, or, you know, I guess that's kind of the catchphrase right now. But one thing that we are embracing in the manifesto and embracing as witches is this idea of changeability and shape-shifting, and this idea that multiple truths can exist at the same time, you know, in the same space, contradict each other, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they're still truths. So, you know, we're trying to embrace this as a method of intersectionality, really. I mean, that's what intersectionality is all about, is acknowledging that multiple truths exist at the same time. That is, you know, my way isn't necessarily the right way. Everything is changeable. I mean, the BioArt Coven Manifesto is a living document. It's meant to shift and change according to the desire and the will of any member of the Coven at any time. So, you know, things have been moved around, they've been sandwiched together to make new contextual meanings. People have deleted some things, people have added things, and this is how it goes, and this is how it will continue to evolve. So something that's stated as a truth that's in there right now might, you know, with a changing context, like a social biopolitical context, change in the future. And that's exactly how it should be.
The part that I was going to mention is your contention that objectivity in science is like illusory, that there is no real objectivity in science, which if you talk to, let's call them non-witches, that's their whole argument, is the objectivity of science, right? Can you expand on this and how you see the lack of objectivity in sciences?
So this is an idea that comes directly from Donna Haraway's writing in the Cyborg Manifesto, in fact. And the Cyborg Manifesto was one of the inspirations, one of the source documents that we looked at in constructing the BioArt Coven Manifesto. You know, so Donna Haraway talks about this idea of objectivity in science being a completely false construct based on God trick methodologies, which, you know, is this idea of seeing everything from nowhere at once. This purist idea of objectivity where all personal experience and emotion is erased from the equation is absolute bullshit. And, you know, I can tell you from working with scientists and working in labs that it is bullshit. I mean, we try to adhere to certain standards, but at some point, those standards do need to be continuously questioned and changed. You know, when they become rigid and unchangeable is when we start to see a lot of problems, because that lack of flexibility means that those structures eventually are going to come crashing down, which we're kind of seeing right now with the pandemic.
Yeah, I was reading a piece about the history of vaccinations and the pandemic, about making the, I think, fairly obvious argument that the anti-vax movement is pretty racist. And one of the pieces of the history there was the history of a lot of vaccination science and understanding came from specifically like one Indigenous healer showing an early settler their treatment for smallpox of taking a bit of the disease and adding it. So the older form of vaccination, which was truly like giving each person a bit of the disease to arm them and make them stronger. And that's not the kind of vaccine that we have now. But the early anti-vaccination rhetoric was that this was shamanistic science, that this was witchcraft, you know.
Wow,
that,
that's I did know about, you know, that first form of vaccination coming from inoculating, or I guess infecting people with horsepox, you know, which is a related disease, but that comes from horses. And that, you know, early on when the smallpox epidemic was happening in North America, people who were in close relationship with horses were less severely affected by the smallpox disease. And, you know, eventually the whole vaccination trajectory kind of stemmed from that. I mean, it makes sense to me, but I hadn't ever heard that initial aspect of the story, that it was an indigenous healer. But this comes back to, you know, multiple truths existing at the same time, where we can also look at very legitimate concerns of women, Black women, indigenous women in particular, being used as experimental subjects for scientific development, leading to a mistrust of the whole scientific and medical institution in general. So, you know, there are these intersecting threads where it's like, okay, maybe it's racist, but it's also wary of colonial practices. So it's a really tricky
it's
waters
also a
to
direct
navigate.
result of racism. Yeah, there's a legacy of racism there that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of fear, and a lot of sense out of fear. I love you bringing it to the idea of the horse pox too. The idea of an interspecies respect that's in the manifesto, an interspecies listening, an interspecies context for disease, or and for health, and for human stability, for humans' place. Like the witch as a connector, as a listener for interspecies conversations is something that we're really excited about and interested in right now. So I loved to see that in the manifesto.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, in witch language or witch terminology, there's always talk of familiars, and that is this, you know, interspecies relationality that characterizes the witch throughout many different mythologies and ages. And so, you know, what if my familiar is a certain species of bacteria that I'm working with in the lab, and it's through my work with that agent that I understand certain biopolitical issues that I'm looking to deal with or talk about or confront or expose or any of those things, you know? So our familiars can be microorganic.
Yeah, that's when you talk about interspecies, Whitefeather, it's like it goes beyond like us and animals. It's like us and, you know, microbes, us and one of my favorite pieces of poetry in the manifesto is when you mention, and I didn't know this, and I almost wept when I read it because it's so poetic and so beautiful, that the words humility and soil come from the same root. Etymologically, I think hummus is the word, I guess.
Humus.
Yes, and
hummus is a very delicious Lebanese.
Yeah. Humus, yeah.
Dish.
Humus, but just this connection between humility and soil, and us and microbes. And you talked about mycelium. Can you first tell our lay listeners what mycelium is and how we can talk to these amazing networks that we're only now beginning to think of as species in their own animal way, please?
So the mycelium is the underground root structure of the fruiting body that we understand as a mushroom or a fungus. And, you know, I really encourage everyone to watch a special on Netflix called Fantastic Fungi. Oh my God.
I just watched
anyway,
it. It's amazing.
It's phenomenal. And, you know, that show does a really, really good job.
While you're at it,
oh, go ahead.
While you're at it, go back and listen to the Maria Sabina episode, because we talk about a lot of the same things in that episode. And then there's so much more context from these lay mushroom researchers and amateurs and scientists. It's just to get in a little personal plug.
Yeah, it's amazing. They do a really, really good job of explaining the connections, you know, between not just the embodied universe of, you know, planet Earth that we live on and in, but also the way that our own, you know, neurobiological structuring works in a very similar communication network of synapses as what occurs underground between the mycelial roots and all of the microorganisms that live on, around, feed off of them, and facilitate them. So I'm exploring this on a personal level right now through microdosing. I just started microdosing this past week in order to attempt to heal some of the neurological damage that I sustained because of having COVID. So, you know, so far so good. I've only been doing it for about 3 days. It's not yet legal in Canada, but that's okay with me. I'm not advocating for anybody else to try it, but I was really inspired to attempt to heal myself this way using fantastic fungi after watching this documentary and after, you know, working with mycelium myself in the lab, in different labs, seeing, you know, how it functions materially, but now also understanding how it functions neurobiologically. It's pretty exciting, or, you know, biochemically, I guess I should say. So, yeah.
There's a beautiful piece in that documentary as well that I've been thinking about ever since, about the sort of theory that they know that like early humans ate psilocybin, like ate a form of a magic mushroom, because they found the traces of that consumption. And then this theory that was the you know, the brain experience of that helped trigger the evolution of language, of communication. So that we might get closer to communication somehow with the species that are like way more dominant than us on this planet, if we can find ways of listening chemically or listening in petri dishes. I don't know, you tell us.
Yeah, I mean, they are the original communication network, and they are part of us. It only makes sense to me that it would facilitate better communication in our own little human brains. You know, this massive global scale underground communication network. I love the underground aspect of it too. I mean, you know, witches are of the underground terrain in terms of subculture. But I also want to mention that, you know, those pieces of text that you're referring to, Amy, talking about, you know, the connections between humility and soil through this concept of humus. And, you know, that's another kind of waste material. It's like forest waste that gets recycled into this beautiful potential for sustaining new life. Those excerpts were not added by me. Those are the words of, you know, people within the Coven who are sort of referencing their own experiences, maybe working with compost as, you know, a biotechnology, and, you know, seeing how that sort of supports and sustains life as a metaphor, as a feminist agitation mechanism, you know, what have you. So those are not my words. I just want to kind of acknowledge all of the other authors of this manifesto, over 50 people contributing. So I can't entirely speak for them. I you know, I can be a representative, but yeah, it would be nice to hear from them too.
That kind of brings me to something that I wanted to bring up, because, you know, there's this notion that like competition, you know, is somehow good for innovation. And I think these kind of open source, you know, collaborative projects are excellent evidence to the contrary of that notion. And again, that brings up something that I wanted to ask you to expand on, because it's something that we quote you all the time as saying and bring it up in many several conversations, which is magic is inherently anti-capitalist. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. You know, it ties back to this philosophy that was advanced by Lynn Margulis in Symbiotic Planet, where she completely deconstructs this idea of the survival of the fittest theory of evolution, and instead puts forward a theory of evolution that's based on cooperation. And, you know, we can see this symbiotic organisms. We are a symbiotic organism. We are a holobiont. We are this, you know, compilation of many bodies into one. And it works the same way in a community. It works the same way in all kinds of different organic structures that exist in the world. So the capitalist mode of production, you know, is exploitative, it's destructive, it's extractive, and hopefully it's going to fail. I mean, I think it's failing now. I think we're all watching it fail miserably, and we're all kind of waiting to see what's next. But also at the same time, we're watching Jeff Bezos go into outer space in a giant penis with his billions and billions of dollars. So I'm not sure if that is solely to serve as an example of the most grotesque extreme of patriarchal capitalism or what. But yeah, it's interesting. Definitely cooperation is the original structure of life on Earth. Fuck you, Jeff.
Fuck you forever, Jeff. I had another quote from the manifesto I wondered if you could just think out loud about, and we would love to share this with readers, and we'd love to be in touch with more of the thinkers that are part of this collaborative work, because we can feel them here in the Coven, in the room around us, and every time you nod to them, we are collectively nodding to them, but we can't wait to hear from them more and hear more of their voices. There's a piece, Our Dance's Gesture to the Play Between Purity and Dirt, Getting in Touch with Embodied Ways of Knowing. We're thinking about dance a lot right now. And I know that in your lab, you co-create rituals, but is there an aspect of that that's a dance to you as well?
So there are members of the BioArt Coven who come from a dance and movement background. And, you know, dance is this beautiful way of activating your body and expressing things that cannot be expressed through words or text or, you know, what have you. And it's a performative aspect of, you know, a broad spectrum of creative practice that is part of what we do as witches. You know, we are performing rituals in the lab or in the forest or wherever, and that necessarily includes the movement of bodies. And so, you know, focusing specifically on movement and, you know, bodily movement through dance is one approach that some of the BioArt Coven members take in their individual practices. So yeah, I mean, I think I need to be doing more dancing right now. I haven't danced in a while, but I can remember when I was in, Amy's dancing right now. Yeah, we're all dancing. I can remember when I was in the early stages of like recovering from pretty acute COVID. One of the ways that I was able to sort of cope with and move through my trauma literally was to put on one of my most favorite, craziest upbeat tempo songs and just start shaking my body all over the living room and move and, you know, like expel some of that energy. So I think that dance can also be a way for us to cope with our collective trauma in this capitalist scenario that we're currently embroiled in, that's baking the earth, flooding the earth.
Yeah, we keep coming back to this idea as we dig into these different witches' histories, missing witches' histories, keep stumbling upon this realization that a history of capitalism and colonialism is a history of dance is outlawed. We've talked about that with some dance researchers, why that overlap happens again and again, the control of the body and the control of the knowledge that's in a dance. The communal knowledge, the way of like shifting into the lunar mind that can happen when we're out of this sort of default ego mode. So I loved seeing that in the manifesto. It's some of the stuff that I'm working on now is all tied to like not getting back into the trap of back pain. And trying to be like entangled with the world, with dance in my ritual. I wanted to ask, and maybe this is kind of dance related, I think for my recent Lammas ritual, there was an aspect of improvised dance to it. You talked about an exquisite corpse method of creating ritual. Can you give our listeners an idea of how that flows, what that looks like? Maybe that's something that we can bring into our covens and into our play.
Yeah, it's really, I love it so much for, you know, the simple fact that it's a non-hierarchical way of structuring a collective coven action. You know, normally when we think of a group ritual, it's within the tradition of Gardnerian Wicca, which has, you know, the high priest and the high priestess. And so you have this binary hierarchical structure that makes me want to vomit. So this is a way of completely getting away from that and allowing each member of the coven to take ownership for, you know, one aspect of the ritual. And the way that I facilitated this was to, you know, have our large group kind of break out into smaller groups of like 2 or 3 people. And each of those smaller groups would focus on one aspect of the ritual, whether, you know, it was the opening aspect, whether it was the manifestation aspect, whether it was the closing part of the ritual. And they were doing this separate from the total group, but then came back into the total group and guided, you know, each group sort of one by one would guide the rest of the group through enacting this together. So the entirety of the ritual was kind of sequentially led by different members of the coven, you know, following your sort of more traditional structure of how a ritual should work, you know, open, call the forces or agents you want to address and be there to support your actions, what you want to manifest, and, you know, what sort of strategies you're going to employ to manifest that, and then kind of the gratitude and closing aspect of the ritual. So that's kind of the structure we followed, but it could be any structure that anybody wants to work with to conduct a ritual. It's just that each person is enabled and empowered to fulfill a leadership role in bringing their own aspect of the ritual into play and guiding the performance, and it becomes a collective performance. And it was so beautiful. It was just, it's allowing for that element of chance and not, enabling each person to sort of step forward into this ownership and leadership role that just beautifully distributes the power in the group. And that's kind of what I'm interested in.
Yeah, there's another sort of Whitefeather catchphrase that we use a lot, which from our first meeting, you said, hypotheses are prophecies, methodology is ritual. And that was such a great way of like shifting, once again, that, this demonized voice versus this accepted voice. So logically, I'm using air quotes here because I don't like to say logically too often, but logically, we can understand how ritual and methodology help run a lab. Can you tell me and our listeners how rituals of this kind help us run our lives?
Well, I mean, other than the fact that our lives are intersected with different people and agents that have their own will and direction all the time, and we need to learn how to collaborate and cooperate with that. It comes back to dance. It's a way of putting your will into action and motion. And you can follow a series of steps to do that. And, those steps can incorporate some repetitive actions, and that kind of becomes ritual, but that's also how craft happens. The craft of ritual, if you will. And it's the exact same thing that happens in a lab. And, different philosophers have written about this. Bruno Latour is the first who comes to mind. Enacting a series of actions in order to target a specific change or outcome is, what we do as a ritual. When you account for the other agents in the equation and incorporate their agency into the ritual, it just amplifies it. It amplifies the affect of the ritual. It has more meaning to more people or more elements, more microbes. Maybe it has me. I don't know if it has meaning to microbes. But it's a method of amplification of affect for me, is when you allow people, I'm thinking in terms of the BioArt Coven in this particular instance, when you allow people to invest their own meaning, all together at the same time, you have this fantastic amplification of meaning or affect that can allow you to more powerfully manifest what you hope to see in the world. Did I answer your question, or did I just go off on a total tangent?
We love tangents. Tangents answer questions.
Tangents
it's
are
tentacular thinking,
right?
That's
yes.
So if like group rituals are amplification, do solitary rituals have this same amplification? Your answer was a lot about the communal effect of agency and combining agency. What about when we do rituals by ourselves?
So we're never doing a ritual by ourselves. Even solitary, so-called solitary rituals, we are calling in forces, energies, microbes, symbols, things that represent other things to be with us and support us in our work at all times. So we're never working alone. I mean, that would just be buying into this whole individualism that is plaguing the earth right now. I don't buy it. we as witches don't practice that?
It's Mabon. It's fall. We're tipping into the dark. What's a ritual for you at this time? Or what's an idea you want to plant, a seed you want to plant in the listener's ears, a practice that they can take forward today for this holiday or for this season? Do you want them to make something out of their menstrual blood? What's the challenge you're posing to the witches today?
So, this sort of final harvest aspect of the season, of course, leads us towards death and decay. And, that right now becomes ever present. And so, and it's something that we're dealing with as such a heavy, heavy topic right now in the world because of the pandemic and because there's so much loss happening. So I think that, for a lot of people, trying to conceptualize this in a different way, might be helpful or might be comforting, might be a way for us to put our energies into a place where the greater aspect of things can give us a new meaning. So, I'm thinking of in terms of when the crops are falling in a field, when the fruits of our labors have been harvested and we're enjoying those, what's left in the field and what is it doing? And this is a really, really, really productive, important aspect of the whole equation of harvest, because without this microbial action that's happening in the field, or a mycelial action to kind of break down the waste that's left, there's not going to be any harvest next year. So, I would kind of encourage people to think about what microbes are in the soil, what species are in the soil that are facilitating the future harvest right now through this process of decay and decomposition and so-called death. It's not really death. Think about the richness of that. I would be really interested in going into a field, or people even can just do this with compost bins in their backyard and inspect. We can inspect on a sensory level. We can inspect by culturing some of these microbes in a petri dish and looking at them under a microscope. That would be exciting. But, also just think about the smells and embrace the smells and think about how it feels. Sometimes it's crumbly, sometimes it's slimy, it's full of biofilms. Think about all of these rich things that are the next stage, I guess, after harvest, while we are enjoying our harvest. I know I've been enjoying some corn on the cob and beans and making hodgepodge and all of these wonderful meals lately, but there's the next aspect that's part of that to come. So I think we might need to find a way to move through our collective trauma together right now and recontextualize that somehow in a way that can support us in moving forward.
Yes. I think for my Mabon, inspired by you and your BioArt Coven mates, shout out BioArt Coven and all your multiplicity, is once again, both literally and metaphorically, the connection between humility and soil. And also witches never forget to think about what's going on underground, literally and metaphorically. So that's how I'm going to spend my Mabon.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna go for a walk in the woods with no shoes on and dig my feet into some things and smell some things and be comfortable with the idea of my own deviancy and decay. And I wish it for all of you witches. Happy Mabon. We love you.
Thank you so much, as always, and forever, Whitefeather Hunter, for the validation and the credibility that I feel that you continue to give all of us every day, every moment of every day. Thank you so much. Happy Mabon to you and to the whole multiple BioArt Coven, and to our listeners.
Yay! Happy Mabon, everyone.
Oh, and if they're looking for you, where can they find you? Where can people find you?
On Instagram at BioArt Coven. That is a platform that I use to, put out my own research, but also to amplify all of the research and activities of all of the members of the BioArt Coven who have Instagram profiles. So that's the best place. Yeah, and I want to really acknowledge with so much gratitude the founder, director, facilitator of the School of Machines Making and Make Believe, who Rachel Ua, who allowed me to offer the BioArt Coven as a course twice through her school. It's sort of run out of Berlin, and to really help mobilize this group of people who all came together to become the BioArt Coven. So, she needs some acknowledgement there. She's very much a key part of what this coven is.
Can you say the name one more time?
It's Rachel Uwa, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. It's spelled UWA. Which is funny because I'm doing my PhD at UWA.
And it's Machines Making and Make Believe.
The School of Machines Making and Make Believe.
Yeah. You had me at hello, Rachel. Happy Mabon.
Yeah, and Rachel, she'd be happy to talk to you as well. I think she's, amazing person.
Oh, we can't wait. We'll reach out and continue to weave this web of ideas. We, as Amy indicated many times, we carry a lot of the concepts that you've given us with us a lot. So I love you as a friend and as a witch and as a weaving spider witch. So thanks again.
Right back at you, community weaver.
Go forth, witches, and weave your community. Expand and amplify your agency together. You are never alone. Oh, it's too quotable. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this one.
It's too quotable.
You're too quotable.
You must be a witch.
Season 6 of the Missing Witches podcast is sponsored in part by Foxglove Farm. Go to Foxglove Farm, that's farm with a PH, like pharmacy.com, and use offer code MISSINGWITCHES when you sign up for your monthly subscription box of witchy delights. And sponsored by listeners like you. You who join our Patreon and come to our coven meetings, who buy our book, recommend it to your friends, and review it online. We thank you. And if you love this episode, tip us at paypal.me/missingwitches.